The first time I saw the flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the lake water, I thought maybe I'd moved into a crime scene. My U-Haul was still half-packed, my brother-in-law was trying to wrangle the dolly down the driveway, and my wife was yelling from inside about which box had the coffee maker when the patrol cars pulled up in tandem. Their tires crunched across the gravel in perfect HOA-approved synchronization, and two officers stepped out like they'd just been summoned to a hostage situation. That was the moment I realized my new neighbors had actually called 911 on me, for the crime of moving into my own house. The cops weren't aggressive, not at first. They looked more confused than anything else, because it's not every day you're dispatched to handle a suspicious moving truck at a property deeded to the very man holding the keys in his hand. One officer gestured toward the street, and that's when I saw the gathering. A semicircle of folding chairs and crossed arms lined the sidewalk, like some impromptu Greek chorus of suburban entitlement. At the center, perched with a clipboard balanced across her knees, sat a woman who radiated authority she didn't actually have. The HOA president, the neighborhood's self-crowned monarch. She gave me that slow, deliberate headshake people reserve for toddlers reaching toward stove burners. She spoke before the cops could. "This man is trespassing. He's unloading furniture into a property that doesn't belong to him. I demand immediate removal." I laughed. Couldn't help it. The sound came out sharper than I intended, a bark of disbelief that only fueled her fury. One of the officers cleared his throat and asked for identification. I handed him my driver's license and, because I knew this was only the beginning, my property deed as well. Watching her expression sour as he compared the paperwork to the address behind me was like sipping cold lemonade on a summer afternoon. But here's the thing about people like her. They don't fold when confronted with facts, they escalate. She snapped that the deed must be forged, that squatters use sophisticated methods these days, and that the HOA had already decided my move-in was invalid because I hadn't applied for architectural review approval of my truck. The officer's eyebrows climbed so high they nearly disappeared under his cap. I thought that would be the end of it, but I underestimated her talent for dramatic reinvention. She pivoted from accusing me of fraud to accusing me of endangering the block with hazardous equipment. My dolly. A dolly was apparently a public safety threat now. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law whispered in my ear, "You weren't kidding about HOA horror stories." He'd laughed when I warned him earlier, figured I was exaggerating. Now he was staring at the suburban militia convened across the street like he'd wandered into a documentary about cult dynamic. My wife joined us, holding the coffee maker triumphantly, and asked if the neighborhood always greeted new homeowners with police escorts. The cops tried to wrap it up, gently explaining that I was the legal owner and had every right to move in. They suggested the HOA president take her concerns to civil court instead of emergency dispatch. But she wasn't listening to them. She was staring at me, eyes narrowed, as though calculating how much power she'd just lost. That was the moment I realized she wasn't fighting because she believed I was trespassing. She was fighting because she'd seen the moving truck, realized she didn't control me yet, and panicked. I didn't tell her right then that I owned more than just the lake house. That little card would stay in my pocket until the perfect moment. Instead, I thanked the officers, shook their hands like we were old friends, and invited them to stop by for coffee once the place was in order. My wife played along, offering them a bag of donuts she'd picked up earlier. Nothing makes an HOA look weaker than when law enforcement walks away eating pastries you handed them. The spectators across the street didn't disperse. They whispered, scribbled notes, and snapped photos like amateur paparazzi. I waved at them, which only fanned the flames. The president called after me that fines would be issued immediately. For what, she didn't specify, though I suspected she'd invent something by sundown. My brother-in-law muttered that he'd put money on improper truck tire treads being next. By evening, we had most of the furniture inside. I was carrying the last box when a printed notice slapped against my front door, secured with a strip of neon tape. It was a violation slip, accusing me of unsanctioned moving activity, and threatening daily fines until the board convened to review my conduct. It wasn't even subtle. She'd written it by hand, underlining certain words 3 times for effect. My wife wanted to tear it down, but I told her to leave it. Let her think the intimidation was working. After dinner, I walked down to the dock to breathe. The lake was calm, reflecting the glow of porch lights from the opposite bank. I could hear laughter from families, kids chasing fireflies, the hum of boat engines in the distance. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I'd bought this property for. And yet, behind me, the HOA president's porch light stayed on, casting a beam directly at my house like a searchlight. She wanted me to know I was under surveillance. That was when I started to plan. Not revenge, not yet. Just strategy. I knew her type. Control was her oxygen, and neighbors were her subjects. But she had made one fatal miscalculation, assuming I was just another resident she could bully. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the paperwork in my files went far beyond a single deed. I'd acquired multiple parcels around the lake when the market dipped, consolidating them under a trust. On paper, the HOA believed they governed this entire block. In reality, they were trespassing on mine. The irony made me smile as I walked back inside. My wife asked if I was okay, and I told her I was more than okay. The HOA thought they'd won a battle by slapping a neon violation on my door, but they had no idea they'd already lost the war. I hadn't just moved into a house today. I'd moved into checkmate. Still, the first night wasn't exactly restful. Between unpacking, the glow of that spotlight across the street, and the occasional sound of car doors as neighbors patrolled past my driveway, it felt less like moving into a lake house and more like deploying into hostile territory. I lay awake, running through scenarios, imagining their next moves. Would they escalate to noise complaints? Parking violations? Fabricated safety hazards? Each guess ended with the same conclusion. The louder they shouted, the harder they'd crash when the truth came out. Morning brought the next act. Before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, another notice appeared. This one slipped under my door like contraband. It declared that my residence was subject to immediate compliance hearings, and that until then, all deliveries, renovations, and gatherings were prohibited. She'd even signed it with a flourish, like she was some medieval queen issuing a royal decree. My brother-in-law laughed so hard he nearly spilled his mug. My wife just rolled her eyes and said, "They really don't know who they're dealing with." The next morning the neighborhood was buzzing like someone had kicked over a hornet's nest. I'd expected hostility, maybe a few side glances or some whispered gossip, but this was different. There were cars parked nose to nose along the curb, clipboards flashing in the sunlight, and at least 3 people with walkie-talkies pretending they were conducting some kind of security operation. My wife stepped out onto the porch with her coffee and muttered, "Did we move into a suburb or a spy movie?" I wanted to laugh, but the truth was, this was exactly how people like the HOA president consolidated their power, through theater. Theatrics had always been her strongest weapon. She showed up in person not long after, marching down the sidewalk in a pastel blazer that looked too stiff for the September humidity. Flanked by 2 other board members, she stopped dead center in my driveway and began reading from a printed page. It was a cease and desist letter, accusing me of illegally occupying the premises, and warning that the board would pursue legal action if I did not vacate within 72 hours. I let her finish the performance before I responded. I told her calmly that she was trespassing on private property and that unless she left my driveway, I'd have no choice but to call the same police she had wasted time with yesterday. Her jaw clenched. The 2 board members flinched as if I'd spoken blasphemy. And then she pivoted again, accusing me of intimidation and threatening to report me for harassment. My wife, never one to hold back, leaned out the door and said, "Lady, you literally brought a posse to our driveway." The 2 board members looked like they wanted the ground to swallow them whole. They retreated eventually, but not before taping another violation notice to my mailbox. This one claimed my moving boxes constituted unsightly debris. My brother-in-law, who was helping me break down cardboard in the garage, read it aloud 3 times, unable to process the absurdity. Unsightly debris, he repeated, shaking his head. That's what they call the boxes you just moved your life in with. The rest of the day brought a parade of small aggressions. Neighbors drove by slow enough to memorize license plates. A kid on a bike stopped to take a photo of our yard, then darted away. At one point, a man in a polo shirt stood across the street with a camcorder straight out of the early 2000s, narrating into it like he was compiling evidence for some grand trial. If they'd wanted to intimidate me, they should have known better. I'd worked too long in real estate, dealt with too many paper tigers puffed up by homeowner bylaws, to be rattled by surveillance cosplay. Still, I played along. I stacked the violation slips in a neat folder, labeled HOA Comedy, and even left the neon tape on the front door for effect. The more absurd they became, the more leverage I would have later. I didn't need to retaliate yet. I needed them to build my case for me. Every slip, every recording, every incident was a brick in the wall they were building around themselves. That evening, I decided to take a walk down by the lake. I wanted to enjoy the shoreline, clear my head, maybe even wave at a few neighbors who weren't part of the president's army. But the moment I stepped onto the shared path, a woman in yoga gear intercepted me. She informed me in a clipped tone that the dock was for residents only. I told her I was, in fact, a resident. She squinted, studied me like I was lying, and then said she'd have to check with the board. The way she said it reminded me of a medieval villager asking permission from the castle. I almost asked if she needed to consult the queen, but I bit back the sarcasm. I didn't want to give them sound bites to twist. When I got back, my wife had set up a folding table in the driveway with 2 lawn chairs and a cooler of soda. She was waving at every passerby like we were hosting a block party. "If they're going to stare," she said, "we might as well give them a show." A couple of kids actually came over and grabbed sodas before their parents frantically called them back. My wife laughed and toasted me with her can. That moment, the absurdity of it all, reminded me why I wasn't angry yet. I was amused. The more they tried to box me out, the more ridiculous they made themselves look. But late that night, things shifted. Around midnight, motion lights flashed across the yard. I checked the window and saw 2 figures creeping around near the side of the house. They weren't burglars. They were older, one with a flashlight, the other with what looked like a clipboard. They were inspecting my trash cans. I stepped outside and asked if they were lost. They froze, then muttered something about ordinance violations, before scurrying off into the shadows. My wife, now wide awake, asked what the hell they were doing. I told her not to worry, but inside I was taking note. They weren't just bluffing anymore, they were escalating. By the following morning, a packet arrived in the mail slot. A thick one. Inside was a list of alleged infractions. Improper mailbox color, non-standard garden hose, unapproved doormat. It was laughable, except for one detail. They'd fined me a total of $4,200 for moving in. My wife nearly choked on her coffee. My brother-in-law suggested framing the letter. I said nothing. I just added it to the folder. Later that day, I made a phone call to the county clerk's office. I asked them to pull the records on the HOA's incorporation, their bylaws, their jurisdiction. The woman on the line chuckled and said, "We've had a few calls like this lately." She sent me everything I needed, and as I scanned the documents that night, the corners of my mouth curled. Their entire claim of authority hinged on parcels that weren't even under their control anymore. I had bought them fair and square years ago, consolidating them quietly while the market dipped. The HOA had been posturing over land they technically no longer governed. I didn't say a word to them. Not yet. Instead, I let them keep piling it on. The more they pushed, the stronger my reveal would be. It was like watching someone bet their life savings on a hand you knew was a bluff. They thought they had leverage because they'd invented it. They thought fines and notices could scare me into submission. But all they were doing was digging their own grave, one violation at a time. That weekend, the president herself tried again. She cornered me in front of the garage while I was unloading some tools. She told me she'd give me one last chance to cooperate, to pay the fines and submit to board authority. Her exact words. Submit to authority. I could feel the smirk tugging at my lips, but I kept my voice level. I told her I appreciated her concern, but she might want to double-check her records before she went any further. The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes told me she'd heard rumors. Maybe she'd caught wind that not everything was as it seemed. But pride is a powerful thing, and she doubled down, insisting the board's power was absolute. I just nodded, wiping my hands on a rag. "We'll see," I said. And that was it. No threats, no explanations. Just a promise hanging in the humid air. By Monday morning the absurdity had reached a fever pitch. I walked outside expecting to see my driveway empty, maybe a stray newspaper or two. Instead, I found 3 orange traffic cones blocking the entrance like I was about to host a road race. A laminated sign taped to one of them declared, "Access restricted until fines are paid." My brother-in-law laughed so hard he had to sit down on the tailgate of his truck. My wife just shook her head and muttered, "They've lost their damn minds." I didn't touch the cones. I didn't move the sign. I simply pulled out my phone, snapped a few photos, and tossed them into the growing evidence file. Let them stack their violations like kindling. I was happy to wait for the match. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I strolled across the street where 2 of the board members were standing with their arms crossed, watching my reaction like stage directors waiting for applause. "Morning," I said, cheerful as ever. "You guys know these cones are on private property, right?" One of them, a man with a sunburned nose and the perpetual look of someone who never wins arguments at home, puffed out his chest and told me the board had authorized them. I asked politely for the statute, the ordinance, the legal precedent, anything that gave them the right to blockade a homeowner's driveway. He stammered something about community standards. I just smiled and said, "Perfect. Thanks for clarifying." Then I turned and walked away. By the time the mail arrived, the cones were gone. No note, no explanation. It was the first crack in their armor. They wanted to intimidate, but they didn't want to risk having their bluff called in front of actual authorities. Later that day, my wife convinced me to take her out to the local diner. We needed a break from the surveillance circus. Over pancakes and coffee, the waitress leaned in and asked quietly if we were the ones moving into the lake house. When I said yes, she gave a sympathetic smile. "That HOA's been a thorn in everyone's side for years," she whispered. "Most folks around here just put up with it. They think there's no other choice." Her words stuck with me. No other choice. That was how people like the president thrived, convincing everyone that resistance was futile. But I knew better. There was always another choice, especially when the foundation of their power was built on paperwork they didn't actually control. When we came back, there was a new letter taped to the door. This one was thicker, stapled together like it carried real weight. Inside was a summons to appear at a mandatory compliance hearing scheduled for Thursday evening. It claimed the board would be reviewing my numerous violations and deciding appropriate penalties. The arrogance was staggering. They had written it like a court order, even though they had no authority beyond scolding people about lawn height and mailbox paint. My wife wanted to tear it up on the spot. My brother-in-law suggested we mail it back with doodles on it. I did neither. I placed it carefully in the folder, poured myself a drink, and began drafting my own paperwork. Not a notice, not a fine, but a certified packet of property records, deeds, trust documents, maps, everything proving that their jurisdiction had ended the moment I signed those purchase contracts years ago. The trick would be timing. I didn't want to reveal it in private correspondence. I wanted the maximum audience. Tuesday came with more nonsense. Someone, probably one of the board's loyalists, left a printed flyer on every doorstep in the block. The flyer declared me a hostile squatter and urged neighbors to report any suspicious activity on my property. The language was so overblown it bordered on parody. My wife nearly doubled over laughing when she read the part about unauthorized lawn ornaments. At that point, the only thing in our yard was a garden hose and a folding chair. Apparently, those counted as dangerous ornaments now. But not everyone fell for it. That afternoon, an older man from 2 houses down wandered over while I was fixing the gate latch. He leaned on his cane and said quietly, "Don't let them scare you. Half of us are tired of their games, but nobody wants to be the first to fight back." His eyes twinkled when he added, "Maybe you're the one who finally does." Then he shuffled away before the surveillance squad could catch him fraternizing with the enemy. By Wednesday the board had escalated again. This time, they sent a letter threatening to tow any vehicles parked in my driveway. My wife's SUV, my brother-in-law's truck, even the moving van we hadn't finished unloading. They claimed the vehicles were unregistered with the HOA. My brother-in-law practically begged me to let them try. He wanted nothing more than to watch a tow truck attempt to haul his 8,000-pound diesel off private property. I told him patience. The show wasn't until tomorrow. That night I barely slept. Not from nerves, but from anticipation. The president thought she was walking into a coronation, another performance where she could flaunt her clipboards and fines in front of an obedient crowd. But she was walking into her own undoing. I had rehearsed it in my head 100 times, how I'd present the records, how I'd keep my voice calm, how I'd let the silence stretch until the weight of reality crushed her composure. Thursday evening arrived. I walked to the clubhouse where they held their meetings, a squat brick building with cheap blinds and the faint smell of mildew. The parking lot was full. Apparently, word had spread, because nearly every neighbor was there, curious to see the fireworks. Inside, folding chairs were lined up in rows, a cheap podium at the front. The president sat flanked by her board members like a jury of self-appointed gods. When I entered, her lips curled into a smirk. She opened the meeting with the pomp of a dictator. She listed my alleged crimes: moving in without approval, unsightly boxes, dangerous dollies, unregistered vehicles. Each accusation drew murmurs from the audience, some sympathetic, others skeptical. She read them with relish, like she was savoring every syllable. Finally, she declared that the board would decide whether I was permitted to remain. I raised my hand. Calm, polite. "If I may, I'd like to address the board." She allowed it with a triumphant nod, certain she was granting me my last words. I stepped forward, pulling a thick envelope from my bag. I set it on the podium and began sliding out documents one by one. Certified deeds, parcel maps, trust agreements, each stamped, notarized, indisputable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply explained, point by point, how their jurisdiction ended years ago when the parcels were sold. How the board had been operating under outdated map. How every property they believed they governed was actually under the trust one controlled. The room fell silent except for the shuffle of paper. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes widening as the truth unfolded. The president's smirk evaporated, replaced by the pale stiffness of someone watching their empire crumble. One of the board members whispered something in her ear. She shook her head, too stunned to respond. I ended simply. "I appreciate the invitation tonight, but this hearing has no legal standing. You cannot fine me. You cannot restrict me. In fact, you have been trespassing on property that is no longer yours to govern." Then I stepped back, leaving the papers spread across the podium like evidence in a trial. The morning after the hearing, the air felt different. Lighter, sharper, like the neighborhood had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. For the first time since moving in, I didn't wake to the sight of watchers parked across the street with clipboards. No one snapped photos of my trash cans. No one paced my driveway like it was contested territory. It should have been a victory lap moment, but I knew better than to celebrate too early. People like the president didn't vanish after one humiliation. they doubled down. Sure enough, by mid-morning a new tactic appeared. A thick envelope slid under my front door. Inside was a letter not from the HOA but from an attorney. Or rather, from a firm she claimed represented the HOA. The letter was worded like a formal cease and desist, filled with threats about trespassing, breach of contract, even fraud. At the bottom, though, I noticed something odd. The signature of the attorney was a printed name with no license number, no bar association stamp. It was Theodore again. She'd paid for letterhead and assumed I wouldn't notice the details. My wife spotted it instantly. "She's bluffing," she said, tossing it aside. "The woman's crumbling." But bluff or not, it revealed her strategy. She wanted to frighten me into a mistake, into overreacting or countersuing prematurely. Instead, I stayed the course. I called the clerk's office again and verified what I already knew. There was no lawsuit, no pending motion, no record of the HOA retaining counsel. It was smoke and mirrors. And smoke, I knew, always clears. That evening, I walked down the street to check the mailbox and found two neighbors waiting for me. A husband and wife I hadn't met yet, both looking hesitant, as if afraid to be seen too close. The wife finally spoke, lowering her voice. "We've been paying fines for years, thousands of dollars. 4 paint colors, fence heights, holiday lights. If what you said at the meeting is true, then we've been scammed." Her husband added that they wanted copies of the documents I'd shown. I promised to provide them. Their relief was palpable, like someone had finally cracked open a locked door. That was the real shift. It wasn't just about me anymore. Word spread quickly that the HOA's power was hollow, that their fines were unenforceable, that their threats were built on sand. Neighbors began approaching quietly, asking questions, venting frustrations, telling stories about money they'd handed over to avoid trouble. One man admitted he'd refinanced his car to pay off landscaping violations. Another family said they'd stopped decorating for holidays because they couldn't afford the penalties. Their shame burned as they spoke, but underneath it was anger. Real, simmering anger. By Wednesday, that anger bubbled into something more tangible. Flyers began circulating, not from the HOA this time but from residents calling for a vote to dissolve the board entirely. The president must have seen them because she stormed into my driveway in the late afternoon, demanding to know if I was behind the campaign. She was red-faced, breathing hard, her hands shaking as she pointed at me. "You've poisoned this community," she spat. "Do you have any idea what chaos you've unleashed?" I kept my tone even. "Maybe it's not chaos. Maybe it's freedom." Her eyes narrowed. "They'll regret this. They'll all regret siding with you." Then she turned sharply and stalked away, clipboard clutched like a shield. That night, a different kind of storm arrived. Around midnight, a pounding at the door jolted us awake. I opened it to find 2 sheriff's deputies standing there, their cruisers idling at the curb. They explained they'd received a call about domestic disturbance at my address. Of course, there was no disturbance. My wife and I were half asleep in bed when they knocked. But the report had been specific, detailed, and obviously false. The deputies weren't hostile, just tired. One of them apologized and said, "We've had a few of these from this neighborhood before. Sorry to bother you." As they left, I caught sight of a figure standing on a porch across the street. Arms folded, porch light casting her silhouette like a villain in a stage play. She wanted me rattled. Instead, she'd just confirmed how desperate she'd become. False police reports weren't strategy. They were panic. The next morning, I filed a report of my own. I brought the deputy's card, the false violation letters, and the phony attorney notice to the county office. I explained the situation calmly, handed over copies of my deeds, and asked them to put it all on record. The clerk didn't look surprised. She said they'd had complaints before but never enough documentation to act. "This," she said, tapping my folder, "is enough." Word of that spread too. By Friday, neighbors were openly challenging the board. A group gathered in front of the clubhouse, waving copies of my documents and demanding refunds. The president tried to quiet them, insisting it was all misinformation, but her voice no longer carried authority. It cracked, wavered, dissolved under the noise of collective anger. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face. That weekend brought a flood of visitors to my porch. People I hadn't spoken to yet, families who'd avoided me out of fear of retaliation. They came with stories, receipts, copies of checks they'd written to the HOA. One man carried a binder full of violation slips stretching back years. "They made us repaint the house 3 times in 6 years, he said bitterly. "And now you're telling me they had no right?" His wife's hands shook as she held the paperwork. I nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The anger was no longer simmering. It was boiling. A plan began to form, whispered first, then spoken louder. What if we called a community meeting ourselves? Not the board's meeting, but ours. A gathering without their gavel, their fines, their intimidation. A chance to decide together what came next. I agreed, with one condition, that it be held at my property. If they wanted to reclaim their neighborhood, they needed to do it on ground the HOA couldn't touch. The symbolism mattered, and everyone understood it immediately. Sunday afternoon, my yard filled with folding chairs, picnic tables, and the smell of barbecue. Kids ran along the dock, neighbors mingled, and for the first time since moving in, the place felt alive. When everyone settled, I stood on the porch and spoke plainly. I told them what I'd discovered, how the HOA's jurisdiction had ended years ago, how every fine and violation they'd endured was built on nothing but arrogance. I handed out copies of the deeds, explained the legal path forward, and reminded them that their power had always been collective. They'd just forgotten it. The applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for themselves, for finally shaking off the weight of years. People hugged, laughed, and cried. One older woman admitted she hadn't planted flowers in her yard for over a decade because she was terrified of the fines. That day, she promised to fill her yard with roses. By the time Monday evening rolled around, the block felt like a battlefield where one side didn't realize the war had already shifted against them. Nearly every house wore a neon violation slip like some twisted badge of honor. The HOA president had plastered them across the neighborhood in a frantic attempt to claw back authority. But instead of inspiring fear, they inspired laughter. People left them up on purpose, neon pink and orange flapping in the breeze like flags of rebellion. Someone even taped theirs to the hood of their car and drove laps around the block. From my porch, I could see the slow unraveling of her empire. Neighbors who once kept their heads down were now out front, chatting openly about their fines, comparing stories, laughing at the absurdity. A group of teenagers had started a running tally on a chalkboard, HOA violations of the week. They treated it like a scoreboard, updating it every time another notice appeared. The whole neighborhood was mocking the very thing they once feared. But I knew mockery alone wouldn't be enough. She was wounded, but wounded animals are dangerous. And I was proven right the next day. Tuesday morning, 2 county code enforcement officers showed up at my door. Not police, not sheriffs, code enforcement. They carried clipboards and measured expressions. "We've received complaints," one of them said, "about unpermitted construction and unsafe storage." I almost laughed. The only thing in my yard was a garden hose and a grill. I invited them inside, showed them around, let them poke through the garage, the attic, even the crawlspace. They found nothing. At the end, one officer sighed and said quietly, "We figured as much. These complaints have been coming in non-stop. Same handwriting, same caller ID. You should know, we're documenting who's filing them." That was the crack I needed. It wasn't just me anymore. She was harassing county employees, wasting their time, building a record against herself. I thanked them, shook their hands, and added the incident report to my growing stack of evidence. The file was thick now, a perfect paper trail of her descent from nuisance to liability. Later that afternoon, I walked the block with copies of my deeds under one arm and a calm smile on my face. Neighbors gathered around as I explained the next step. "You're free," I told them, But you don't feel it yet because she keeps shouting. The only way this ends is if we make it official. I laid out the plan. File a petition with the county to dissolve the HOA, backed by signatures and evidence of fraud. It wouldn't be quick, but it would be final. The murmurs grew into cheers. People lined up at my porch, one after another, signing their names on the petition form I drafted. By evening, more than half the neighborhood had signed. The tide wasn't turning anymore, it had turned. Of course, she noticed. She always noticed. That night, her porch light stayed on like a lighthouse of fury, and I could see silhouettes pacing behind her curtains. Around midnight, a car screeched to a halt outside my house. Something splattered against the driveway, raw eggs, dripping and sticky. My wife jerked awake, furious, but I calmed her. "Let it go," I said. "She's reduced herself to eggs. That's not power. That's desperation." We cleaned it up in the morning, laughing about how even her vandalism was petty. But on Wednesday she played her boldest card yet. She filed an emergency motion with the county court, claiming the HOA had authority to evict me for noncompliance. It was laughable, built entirely on outdated maps and fraudulent jurisdiction, but she filed it anyway. The court clerk called me directly, her voice tinged with exasperation. "We've received dozens of these filings from the same person. None of them stand. But this one names you directly, so you'll want to respond formally." I drove down to the courthouse, deeds in hand, and filed my rebuttal. The clerk stamped it without hesitation, assuring me it would be dismissed immediately. Still, the symbolism mattered. She wasn't just bullying now, she was trying to weaponize the court system. And failing. Back in the neighborhood, news of her motion spread like wildfire. Neighbors shook their heads, outraged. One man stood on his porch and shouted across the street, "We're done with you, Linda." Her name carried through the air, sharp as a verdict. For the first time, people weren't whispering about her. They were shouting. That evening, we held another gathering in my yard. Folding chairs circled the driveway, kids played tag on the dock, and neighbors brought potluck dishes. It looked less like a protest and more like a block party, which was exactly the point. I stood and explained what she had done, how her filing was already collapsing, how her time was running out. The crowd erupted in applause. People weren't just angry anymore, they were unified. Then something unexpected happened. The older man with the cane, the one who'd quietly supported me early on, raised his hand. "I've lived here 30 years, he said. "We let her push us around because we thought there was no other way. But tonight, seeing all of you together, I don't feel afraid anymore." He paused, his voice cracking. "Thank you. It wasn't about me, though. It was about them realizing the cage had been imaginary all along." Thursday morning brought another escalation. A moving truck pulled up in front of her house. At first, whispers spread that she might be leaving. But no, this wasn't her truck. It belonged to her daughter, who apparently had been living in one of the other properties and had racked up fines of her own. The HOA president, in her fury, had started fining her own family. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. Neighbors gathered in small groups, laughing openly as the daughter carried boxes down the driveway, muttering curses under her breath. By evening, the block was buzzing with gossip. Even her allies were drifting away. That night, the sheriff's cruiser returned, not for me this time, but for her. They parked in front of her house, knocked on the door, and served her with papers. A formal warning for filing false police reports and wasting county resources. The sight of uniformed deputies standing on her porch was the moment the neighborhood had been waiting for. Windows cracked open, neighbors leaning out to watch. A cheer even broke out when the deputies drove away. She didn't come outside after that. Her porch light stayed dark. For the first time, the Queen had retreated into her castle. Friday brought something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Neighbors I barely knew knocked on my door with casseroles, cookies, even a bottle of whiskey. They weren't thanking me for defeating her. They were thanking me for reminding them they weren't powerless. My wife, ever the pragmatist, joked that we'd earned enough food to last a month. My brother-in-law just grinned and said, "I think they're ready for round 2. Because I knew, deep down, it wasn't over yet. People like her didn't fade quietly into the background. They clung to power until their nails bled. But the neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. The balance had shifted permanently. She could try to strike again, but every move she made now only tightened the noose around her own authority. Saturday morning arrived with a kind of eerie calm, the sort that always comes before the sky splits open. For the first time all week, there were no new violation slips, no cones, no flyers, no fake attorneys. The president's porch light stayed dark, her blinds closed. If you hadn't lived through the circus, you might have thought she'd finally given up. But I knew better. Silence wasn't surrender, it was plotting. She was the kind of person who thrived on spectacle, and quiet meant she was brewing something dramatic. My wife suggested we enjoy the reprieve, maybe take the boat out on the lake for the afternoon. I wanted to, I really did, but the stillness gnawed at me. I couldn't relax when I knew she was somewhere behind her curtains, scribbling out her next move. Sure enough, I didn't have to wait long. By noon, the neighborhood buzzed again. Trucks pulled up near the clubhouse, men unloading folding tables, stacks of binders, and what looked like a rented PA system. A banner unfurled across the front entrance, "Emergency Community Assembly." It was her counterattack. If she couldn't crush me with police or courts, she'd try to rally what remained of her followers. But the way she staged it, balloons, banners, even a tray of catered sandwiches, made it look less like a meeting and more like a last-ditch campaign rally. Neighbors wandered over, curious but skeptical. Some laughed at the theatrics, others just rolled their eyes. I stayed back at first, observing from my porch, letting her set the stage. By mid-afternoon, the assembly was in full swing. She stood at the podium, voice amplified through tinny speakers, declaring that the neighborhood was under siege. She called me a squatter king, a fraudulent landlord, and claimed I was plotting to destroy their community values. She even accused me of trying to seize their homes, which drew audible gasps. The sheer desperation of it was staggering. But here's the thing about lies. The more outrageous they are, the faster they collapse. People began to laugh, not with her, but at her. When she waved a binder in the air and declared it proof of my misdeeds, one brave neighbor shouted, "Show us then." She fumbled, flipping through pages filled with nothing but old violation slips and handwritten note. Another neighbor stood and asked, "Where's the county stamp? Where's the deed record?" Murmurs turned into a chorus. She tried to shout them down, but the microphone only made her voice crack louder. It was the first time I'd seen her cornered in her own theater. I decided that was the moment. I walked across the street, folder under my arm, and stood near the edge of the crowd. Heads turned, whispers spread. She spotted me instantly, her face draining of color before flushing scarlet. She pointed at me, her voice shrill. "There he is. The man who wants to destroy everything we've built." I didn't take the bait. I waited until the crowd quieted, then spoke clearly. "Everything you've built," I said, holding up the folder, "was on land you don't own and authority you never had." Then I opened it and began handing out copies of the county's official response to her bogus filing. Stamped, signed, dismissed. Neighbors snatched them eagerly, comparing the documents to the empty pages in her binder. The contrast was undeniable. One was theater. The other was reality. The tide turned in seconds. People began booing, not me but her. They shouted questions she couldn't answer. Someone asked where their fine money had gone. Another demanded receipt. She stammered, insisting she'd protected the community 4 years, but her voice was drowned out by the growing uproar. Finally, one of her own board members, sunburned nose, perpetual sidekick, stood up and said, "This has gone too far. He's right. You've been lying to us." The gasp that followed was like thunder. The president's face twisted, betrayal etched deep. She shrieked at him, called him a coward, but it was too late. The board was fracturing in front of everyone. The man walked away from the podium, leaving her isolated, clutching the microphone like it was a lifeline. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. I simply turned and walked back to my house, the crowd buzzing behind me. By the time I reached my porch, the assembly had disintegrated into shouting matches and angry demands. She had staged her grand comeback, and ended up detonating her own credibility instead. That night, the neighborhood was electric. People knocked on my door, eager to share the fallout. They said the board was dissolving, that several members had resigned, that neighbors were demanding refunds for years of fines. Someone claimed the county was preparing a formal audit of the HOA's finances. My wife poured drinks for everyone who came by, our living room turning into an impromptu town hall. For the first time, the energy wasn't about fear or defiance, it was about possibility. But as always, she wasn't finished. Sunday morning brought the most brazen stunt yet. I woke to the sound of hammering and stepped outside to find workers erecting a fence across the entrance to my driveway. Not the flimsy cones or laminated signs this time, a real chain-link fence, padlocked, with a giant Property of HOA banner zip-tied across it. My wife nearly spit out her coffee. My brother-in-law laughed so hard he doubled over. I didn't touch it. Instead, I called the county sheriff, calmly explained the situation, and invited them to see it for themselves. When the deputies arrived, their disbelief was almost comical. "You said she put up a fence?" one asked, incredulous. I pointed at the shiny padlock glinting in the morning sun. They shook their heads, muttered something about clear case of trespassing, and cut the lock on the spot. Then they hauled the entire structure into the back of their truck, shaking their heads as they left. Neighbors watched from their porches, some cheering, others filming the whole thing on their phones. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. Her last attempt to draw a literal boundary had been dismantled by law enforcement in front of everyone. But I knew what that meant. She wasn't just desperate now, she was reckless. Reckless people are unpredictable, and unpredictability can be dangerous. So that afternoon I took extra precautions. I installed additional cameras around the property, double-checked the locks, and warned my wife and brother-in-law to keep their phones close. I didn't want her next move to catch us off guard. Sure enough, Sunday night brought chaos. Around 11, floodlights suddenly blazed across my front yard. Trucks pulled up, blasting horns, music blaring. A mob had gathered, waving signs scrawled with phrases like, "Save our HOA," and "Stop the fraud." It was small, maybe a dozen people, but loud, intentionally disruptive. She stood at the center, megaphone in hand, screaming about justice and community standard. I didn't engage. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, cameras recording everything. My wife called the sheriff again, and within 20 minutes, deputies rolled in. The crowd scattered quickly once uniforms appeared, leaving the president shouting alone, her voice echoing hollow against the night. The deputies warned her once more, "Continue, and she'd be arrested for disorderly conduct." She retreated reluctantly, glaring at me like I'd stolen her crown. Monday morning broke with a heavy gray sky, the kind that presses down on you, making every sound sharper. The lake was still, too still, and the whole block carried a tension you could almost taste. No neon notices flapped on doors, no surveillance cars rolled slowly past. It felt like the eye of a storm, and I knew it couldn't last. My wife noticed it too. Over coffee she said, "She's going to try something big. You can feel it." She was right. By noon, the move came. A caravan of SUVs pulled into the neighborhood, glossy black with tinted windows. For a second, I thought she'd actually gone off the deep end and hired private security. But when the doors opened, it wasn't muscle, it was suits. A cluster of men and women with briefcases and clipboards, marching toward my house like they owned the place. She followed behind them, her posture tall, her face smug again. Whatever this was, she believed it would be her triumph. One of the suits introduced himself as a compliance auditor. He handed me a packet of papers covered in seals and signatures. At first glance, it looked official, impressive even. But when I slowed down and scanned the details, it unraveled immediately. The seals were photocopies, the signatures generic, and the auditing firm didn't exist anywhere beyond the letterhead. It was a show, another desperate attempt to dress fiction in authority. I handed the packet back and asked one simple question: "Are you licensed with the state?" The man hesitated, glanced at the president, then muttered something about internal jurisdiction. That was all I needed. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and called the county sheriff on speakerphone so the entire crowd could hear. I explained that unlicensed individuals were attempting to conduct a fraudulent audit on private property. The dispatcher didn't even blink. She promised to send deputies immediately. When the cruisers rolled up 10 minutes later, lights flashing, it was the end of the charade. The so-called auditors scattered like startled pigeons, piling back into their SUVs and tearing down the road. The president stayed rooted to the spot, her face pale, watching her last scheme collapse. The deputies approached her, calm but firm, and asked to see her ID. One of them explained she was now the subject of multiple complaints for harassment, false reporting, and fraud. Then, right there in front of the neighbors who had gathered to watch, they told her she would need to accompany them downtown for questioning. The gasp that swept through the crowd was deafening. Neighbors who had cowered for years now stood tall, watching as the woman who had fined them into silence was led toward a patrol car. She tried to protest, screaming about conspiracies and corruption, but the words had no weight anymore. People laughed. One man even clapped sarcastically. For the first time since moving in, I saw no fear in the block, only relief. They didn't cuff her. It wasn't an arrest yet. But the image of her being escorted into the cruiser was enough. Phones recorded every second, and by evening, the footage was everywhere in the neighborhood group chats. HOA Queen hauled off became the headline of the week. Her power didn't just crack that day, it disintegrated entirely. But the fallout was only beginning. Over the next few days, the county launched a full audit of the HOA's finances. Records surfaced of thousands of dollars collected in fines with no accounting for where it went. Checks written to cash, inflated invoices for landscaping that was never done, even rumors of personal vacations billed as community development retreats. It was all unraveling fast and messy. The board, sensing doom, began to resign one by one. The sunburned man who had once stood at her side was the first to step down, issuing a shaky statement about mismanagement. Others followed, leaving the president alone at the helm of a sinking ship. By Thursday, the HOA was effectively dissolved, its authority stripped, its accounts frozen pending investigation. The neighborhood wasn't just free of her, it was free of the entire apparatus. And that freedom was palpable. Yards that had once been sterile now bloomed with color. Flags went up, decorations appeared, families grilled openly on driveways without fear of fines. Kids chalked the sidewalks with cartoons and slogans. No more HOA. People who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly sharing beers, swapping stories, reconnecting. It was like a weight had lifted from the entire block. One evening, the older man with the cane came by again. He stood on my dock, looking out at the water, and said quietly, "You didn't just fight her. You reminded us we had rights. We'd forgotten that." His voice cracked. "You gave us our neighborhood back." I told him it wasn't me, it was all of them. They had chosen to stand up, to sign, to push back. I just lit the fuse. But he shook his head. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to show the rest what's possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. I hadn't moved here to be anyone's savior. I'd wanted peace, quiet, a place to watch the lake ripple under the sunset. But fate, or maybe just stubbornness, had thrust me into the center of a fight. And once I was there, I wasn't the kind of man to back down. Of course, the president didn't vanish entirely. Word filtered back that she'd been barred from serving on any HOA boards in the county ever again. Rumors swirled about potential charges, about restitution, about lawsuits piling up against her personally. Whether or not she faced jail time, her reign was over. She'd gone from queen of the cul-de-sac to a cautionary tale in record time. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I saw her car pull slowly down the block. She didn't stop, didn't wave, just drove past with her windows rolled up, eyes fixed straight ahead. The neighbors ignored her. No glares, no jeers, just indifference. That was the cruelest punishment of all. She wasn't feared anymore. She wasn't even relevant. She was just another driver passing through a neighborhood that no longer belonged to her. Life settled after that. The neighborhood formed a new association, not an HOA, but a voluntary committee to manage shared spaces like the dock and the clubhouse. No fines, no clipboards, just neighbors coordinating potlucks and cleanup. It was simple, functional, and most importantly, free of tyranny. The first meeting was held in my backyard, kids running around while adults debated picnic schedules. It felt like a celebration of normalcy. My wife teased me sometimes, calling me the accidental mayor. She wasn't wrong. People still came to me with questions, advice, plans. Not because I wanted power, but because I had never wanted it, and that made all the difference. One evening, sitting on the dock with my wife and brother-in-law, I thought back to that first day, the flashing police lights, the crowd of neighbors, the president wagging her clipboard like a weapon. She had called 911 thinking she was about to humiliate a trespasser. Instead, she had summoned the beginning of her own downfall. She had tried to play queen on land she didn't own, and in doing so, she had handed me the perfect stage to reveal the truth.